I never imagined that a simple pot of rice would unravel the carefully woven fabric of my entire existence. For 42 years I had cooked rice in the same kitchen, using the same wooden spoon my mother had given me on my wedding day. But on that humid August evening, when I noticed the rice disappearing faster than two people could possibly consume it, I had no idea that following my husband into the darkness would lead me to a truth that would either destroy me or set me free. The kitchen timer chimed its familiar melody at exactly 5:30 in the evening, the same time it had chimed every single day for as long as I could remember. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I wiped my hands on the floral apron that hung loose around my waist, noticing how much smaller I had become over the years, how the fabric that once fit snugly now billowed around my shrinking frame. My name is Dorothy Chen, and at 70 years old, I had perfected the art of invisible labor, the kind of work that keeps a household running smoothly while remaining completely unnoticed by everyone who benefits from it. The rice cooker sat on the counter, steam rising from its vented lid in soft white clouds that dissipated into the warm air of our modest kitchen. I had measured out 4 cups of jasmine rice that morning, the same amount I had been preparing for the past month, ever since I noticed that our usual 2 cups were somehow insufficient. Thomas, my husband of 42 years, had always been a man of predictable appetite. 2 servings of rice with dinner, occasionally 3 if the meal was particularly good, but never more than that. His eating habits were as reliable as the sunrise, which is why the sudden increase in our rice consumption had begun to nag at me like a persistent itch I couldn't quite reach. I opened the rice cooker and stirred the grains gently, watching them tumble and shift under the wooden spoon. The rice was perfect, each grain distinct and fluffy, exactly the way Thomas preferred it. I had learned to cook rice this way from my mother, who had learned it from her mother, a chain of knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that feeding people was both the simplest and most profound way to show love. My mother used to say that you could tell everything about a woman's heart by the rice she served. If it was mushy and overcooked, she was distracted and troubled. If it was undercooked and hard, she was angry and resentful. But if it was perfect, light and aromatic, she was at peace with herself and the world. I had always prided myself on cooking perfect rice. The house we lived in was a small 2-bedroom bungalow in the Riverside neighborhood, a working-class area where the houses all looked somewhat similar with their aluminum siding and chain-link fences. We had bought this house in 1983, when Thomas got his job at the textile factory and I was pregnant with our daughter Linda. The mortgage had been a stretch for us back then, but Thomas had been confident that his steady employment would see us through. He had been right. For 40 years, he had walked to that factory every morning at 6 and returned home every evening at 5. His clothes smelling of cotton fibers and machine oil, his lunchbox empty except for the thermos I washed and refilled each night. Our life had been simple but comfortable. We had raised Linda in this house, watched her grow from a colicky infant into a bright, ambitious woman who now lived 3 states away with her own family. She called every Sunday, her voice cheerful and distant, asking about our health and telling us stories about our grandchildren that I tried to picture in my mind. Thomas Jr., our son, had been gone for 15 years now, taken by a car accident that had hollowed out a part of my heart that never quite filled back in. We didn't talk about Tommy much anymore. The grief was still too sharp, too close to the surface even after all these years. I spooned rice into Thomas's bowl, creating a neat mound that I knew he would methodically consume, grain by grain, while reading the evening newspaper. This was our routine. I would serve dinner at 6 o'clock, and we would eat together in silence, the only sounds being the clink of chopsticks against ceramic and the rustle of newspaper pages turning. After 42 years of marriage, we had long ago exhausted the need for dinner conversation. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and what remained was simply the comfortable quiet of 2 people who knew each other too well to require constant verbal affirmation of their existence. But tonight, as I carried Thomas's bowl to the dining table, I noticed something that made me pause. His work bag, which usually sat empty by the front door after he returned home, was bulging with something heavy. The canvas sides were stretched taut, and I could see the outline of containers pressing against the fabric. I set down the rice bowl and walked over to the bag, curiosity overcoming my usual reluctance to investigate my husband's belongings. Thomas was in the bathroom, I could hear the water running as he washed his hands and face, a ritual he performed with the same meticulous care he applied to everything in his life. I had perhaps 2 minutes before he emerged, and something in me, some instinct I didn't fully understand, compelled me to look inside that bag. I pulled open the zipper slowly, trying to keep the metallic sound to a minimum. Inside were 3 large plastic containers, the kind I use for storing leftovers. I lifted the lid of the top container and found it filled with rice, perfectly cooked jasmine rice, still slightly warm. The second container held the same as did the third. My heart began to beat faster, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years, as though my body was trying to alert me to something my mind hadn't yet processed. Thomas was taking rice from our home. Not just any rice, but rice I had cooked, rice that should have been our dinner, our sustenance. The question that immediately formed in my mind was painfully simple. Why? I closed the containers and zipped the bag shut, then hurried back to the kitchen to compose myself. My hands were trembling slightly as I served my own portion of rice, and I had to steady the bowl against my body to keep from spilling it. The bathroom door opened and Thomas emerged, his gray hair damp at the temples, his weathered face neutral and unremarkable as always. He was 73 years old, 3 years my senior, and he moved with the deliberate slowness of a man whose body had logged decades of hard physical labor. We ate dinner in our usual silence, but this time the quiet felt different to me, charged with the weight of my discovery. I watched Thomas from the corner of my eye, studying him as though he were a stranger I was meeting for the first time. His face gave nothing away. He chewed his rice methodically, read his newspaper, occasionally made a small noise of interest or disapproval at whatever news he was consuming. He seemed utterly normal, utterly unchanged, and yet I felt as though I was sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. After dinner, Thomas stood up from the table, folded his newspaper with precise creases, and carried his empty bowl to the kitchen sink. This too was part of our routine. I would wash the dishes while he retreated to the living room to watch the evening news. But tonight, instead of heading to the living room, Thomas picked up his work bag from by the door and slung it over his shoulder. Going somewhere, I heard myself ask, my voice sounding strange and too loud in the quiet house. Thomas turned to look at me, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise perhaps, or was it guilt? But then it was gone, replaced by his usual placid expression. Just taking a walk, he said. Need to stretch my legs after sitting all day at the factory. This was not part of our routine. Thomas never took evening walks. He had always said that after standing at his station all day, the last thing he wanted to do was spend more time on his feet. But here he was, bag over his shoulder, heading toward the front door as though this were the most natural thing in the world. I'll come with you, I said, the words escaping before I could consider them. Thomas paused with his hand on the doorknob. That's not necessary, Dorothy. You must be tired from cooking all day. I'm not tired, I insisted, already untying my apron. The evening air will do me good. I could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, the rapid calculation of whether protesting further would seem more suspicious than simply acquiescing. Finally, he nodded, his expression carefully neutral. Suit yourself, he said. I grabbed a light cardigan from the coat rack and followed Thomas out into the warm evening air. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the houses lining our street. Our neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with most people inside eating their own dinners or settling in for the evening. A few children were playing in a yard down the street, their laughter carrying on the breeze, and somewhere a dog was barking with persistent enthusiasm. Thomas walked with purpose, his strides longer than I expected for a man his age. I had to work to keep up with him, my shorter legs moving quickly as we headed away from our house, away from the familiar streets of our immediate neighborhood, toward the less maintained areas near the river. The Riverside neighborhood got its name from its proximity to the Clearwater River, a muddy, slow-moving waterway that had once been the lifeblood of the textile industry, but was now mostly known for flooding during heavy rains and hosting a homeless encampment along its banks. I had never been down to the river area myself. Thomas had always warned me away from it, saying it wasn't safe for a woman alone, that the people who lived down there were desperate and unpredictable. But now, as I followed my husband through the deteriorating streets where potholes went unrepaired and streetlights flickered uncertainly, I realized he was heading directly toward the river. The houses here were in worse shape than in our neighborhood, with peeling paint and sagging porches, yards overgrown with weeds and littered with the detritus of poverty, broken appliances, rusted cars, children's toys that had seen better days. "Thomas, where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, casual. "You'll see," he replied, not turning around. We walked for another 10 minutes, the neighborhood growing progressively more run down, until finally we reached a chain-link fence that separated the residential area from the riverbank. There was a gap in the fence, the metal peeled back as though someone had repeatedly squeezed through it, and Thomas headed straight for this opening without hesitation. "Be careful," he said, holding the fence back so I could pass through. "There's broken glass sometimes." I stepped carefully through the gap and found myself on a dirt path that sloped down toward the river. The smell hit me first, a combination of stagnant water with smoke, and something else, something human and unwashed that made my stomach clench. As we descended the path, I began to see them, the tents and makeshift shelters scattered along the riverbank, some fashioned from blue tarps and rope, others from cardboard boxes and plastic sheeting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was the homeless encampment I had heard about on the news, the one the city council was always debating what to do about, though they never seemed to actually do anything. Thomas moved through the encampment with the confidence of someone who had been here many times before. People looked up as we passed, their faces registering recognition when they saw him. A few called out greetings. "Thomas, you're here." "Evening, Mr. Chen. Brought the rice?" I felt as though I had stepped through a portal into another dimension, a world that existed parallel to mine but completely invisible from where I usually stood. These people, dozens of them, maybe more, knew my husband. They were expecting him, and they were asking about rice. We reached a clearing near the water's edge where someone had set up a makeshift kitchen, a propane camping stove balanced on a plastic folding table, some mismatched pots and pans hanging from a rope strung between two trees. A woman stood at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. She was younger than me, maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a bandana and a face that spoke of hardship weathered with dignity. "Dorothy," Thomas said, stopping in the clearing, "this is Patricia." "Patricia, this is my wife, Dorothy." Patricia looked up from her pot and smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "So you're Dorothy. Thomas talks about you all the time. Says you make the best rice in the city." I didn't know what to say. My mind was struggling to process the scene before me. Thomas set down his work bag and began unpacking the containers of rice, handing them to Patricia, who accepted them with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. "This is wonderful, Thomas," Patricia said, opening one of the containers and inhaling deeply. "Still warm. The folks are going to be so happy. We've got a good stew going tonight, and rice is just what we need to stretch it." As if summoned by the mention of food, people began emerging from their tents and shelters, moving toward the clearing with a mixture of eagerness and restraint, as though they didn't want to appear too desperate even though I could see the hunger in their eyes. They were old and young, men and women, even a few children clinging to their parents' hands. Their clothes were worn and dirty, their faces marked by exposure to the elements, but their eyes were what struck me most. Each person carried in their gaze a story of how they had ended up here, and I found I couldn't look directly at them for too long without feeling something painful twist in my chest. Thomas moved among them with ease, greeting people by name, asking about their day, their health, their needs. He knew them. Not just superficially but truly knew them. An elderly man with a white beard told Thomas about his arthritis. A younger woman showed him a cut on her hand that looked infected. A mother introduced him to her toddler, who had just learned to say a few words. And through it all, Thomas listened with an attention and warmth I hadn't seen in him in years, maybe decades. Patricia began serving the stew and rice, ladling generous portions into an assortment of bowls and plates that people had brought with them. The rice I had cooked that morning, the rice that should have been our dinner, was being distributed among these strangers, and they received it with a gratitude that made my throat tight. "Thomas," a young man said, approaching with a battered backpack, "I wanted to show you something." He pulled out a folder of papers. "I got accepted to the community college. Starting classes next month. Couldn't have done the application without your help." Thomas's face broke into a smile, a genuine expression of joy that I realized I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I could remember. That's wonderful, Marcus. I'm proud of you. What are you going to study? Computer programming, Marcus said. Figure it's a skill that'll get me out of here eventually. Get me a real job, a real place to live. You're going to do great, Thomas said, clapping the young man on the shoulder. Keep me updated on how the classes go. I stood at the edge of the clearing, watching this alternate version of my husband, this man who seemed more alive and engaged than the person who sat across from me at dinner every night in silence. He moved from person to person, talking, listening, sometimes just sitting quietly beside someone who seemed to need companionship more than conversation. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the clearing filled with the soft glow of camping lanterns and firelight, I began to understand that I had been living with a stranger for decades. Patricia approached me, carrying 2 bowls of stew and rice. Thought you might be hungry, she said, offering me one of the bowls. I accepted it automatically, my hands closing around the warm ceramic. Thank you. We sat down on a log that had been positioned near the fire, and Patricia began to eat her stew with obvious enjoyment. You seem surprised, she said after a moment. Didn't Thomas tell you about this? No, I admitted. I had no idea. Patricia nodded, as though this confirmed something she had suspected. He's a private man, your husband, but he's been coming here for almost 5 years now. Ever since the encampment formed. Brings rice, sometimes clothes, helps people with paperwork and applications. A few of us have gotten housing because of him. Marcus over there, the young guy who showed Thomas his college acceptance. He was living under a bridge when Thomas found him. Thomas helped him get his GED, helped him apply for financial aid. Changed that kid's life. 5 years. Thomas had been coming here for 5 years, and I had known nothing about it. I watched him across the clearing, sitting with a group of older men, listening to their conversation, occasionally adding a comment that made them laugh. This was where he had been going all those evenings when he said he was going to the corner store, or taking a walk, or meeting an old friend from the factory. This was where the rice had been disappearing to, bowl by bowl, container by container, feeding people who had no other source of reliable nutrition. Why didn't he tell me? I asked Patricia, though I wasn't sure if I was really asking her or asking myself. Patricia considered the question, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of potato. Maybe he thought you wouldn't understand. Maybe he thought you'd worry. Or maybe she paused, looking at me with eyes that seemed to see more than I wanted to reveal. Maybe he needed something that was just his. Something separate from his regular life. Her words hit me with unexpected force because they contained a truth I had been avoiding for a very long time. Thomas and I had been living separate lives for years, occupying the same house but existing in different worlds. I had my routines, my quiet days of cooking and cleaning and waiting. And he had this secret other life where he was needed and valued and seen as something more than just a factory worker counting down the days to retirement. The stew was good, hearty and warming, and I ate it slowly while watching the community around me. People were laughing, talking, sharing stories and jokes. Children were playing a game with stones near the water's edge, their giggles bright in the darkness. Someone had brought out a guitar and was playing softly old folk songs that hung in the air like smoke. It was, I realized with a start, a kind of family, not related by blood, but bound together by their shared circumstances and their determination to survive with dignity intact. Thomas finally made his way over to where Patricia and I were sitting. He lowered himself onto the log with a grunt, his knees creaking in protest. Ready to head home, he asked me, his voice neutral, as though he hadn't just revealed an entire hidden dimension of his existence. I looked at him, this man I had slept beside for 42 years, whose children I had borne, whose meals I had cooked, whose home I had maintained. I looked at his weathered face and gray hair, and the calluses on his hands from decades of factory work, and I realized I had no idea who he really was. Why didn't you tell me? I asked quietly. Thomas stared at the fire, not meeting my eyes. Didn't think you'd understand. Understand what? That you wanted to help people? He shook his head. It's not just that. It's he paused, searching for words. When I'm here, I'm not just Thomas Chen, factory worker who comes home tired and falls asleep in front of the TV. Here, I'm someone who makes a difference. Someone people need. I wasn't sure you'd understand why I needed that. His words stung not because they were cruel but because they were honest. He was right. I wouldn't have understood. I would have thought it was wasteful, taking food from our own table to give to strangers. I would have worried about his safety, Coming to this rough area every evening, I would have felt threatened by his need to find purpose outside of our marriage, outside of the life we had built together. But sitting there in the firelight, surrounded by people whose gratitude toward my husband was palpable and genuine, I found that I did understand. Not completely, not yet, but enough to recognize that Thomas had been starving for meaning just as much as these people had been starving for food. "I'm here now," I said finally. "So help me understand." Thomas looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw surprise in his eyes. "You want to come back tomorrow?" I nodded. And so began the second chapter of our marriage, one I never could have anticipated or planned for. The next evening I cooked 6 cups of rice instead of 4. I packed it carefully into containers and waited for Thomas to come home from the factory. We ate our dinner in silence as always, but this time the quiet felt different, less heavy, more like the pause before something new begins. When Thomas picked up his work bag, I picked up mine too, filled with the extra rice and some vegetables I had stir-fried that afternoon. He looked at my bag, then at my face and nodded once. Together we walked through our neighborhood, through the deteriorating streets, through the gap in the chain-link fence, down to the riverbank where Patricia and the others were waiting. Over the following weeks, I learned the names and stories of the people who lived in the encampment. There was Raymond, the elderly veteran with arthritis who had lost his housing when his disability payments were reduced. There was Sarah and her 5-year-old daughter Emma, who had fled an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes on their backs. There was Miguel, a former construction worker whose injury had left him unable to work, and whose medical bills had consumed everything he owned. There was Jennifer, a young woman barely out of her teens who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go and no support system. Each person carried the weight of circumstances that had pushed them to the margins of society, and each day they fought to maintain their humanity in the face of poverty and uncertainty. I had spent my entire life in working-class neighborhoods, had struggled financially at various points in my marriage, but I had never truly understood what it meant to have nothing, to be invisible to the world, to exist in a space that most people pretended not to see. Patricia became my guide into this world. She had been homeless for 3 years after losing her job as a nurse due to a back injury that made it impossible for her to stand for long shifts. Without income, she had lost her apartment. Without an address, she couldn't get another job. The cycle had trapped her as surely as any cage, but she had found ways to maintain dignity and purpose by organizing the encampment, helping newcomers navigate the complex maze of social services, cooking communal meals with whatever donations came their way. "Your husband's rice has kept us going through some hard times," Patricia told me one evening as we worked together preparing dinner for the camp. There were days when that rice was the only thing standing between us and real hunger. He never missed a day. Rain, cold didn't matter. Thomas always showed up with that rice. I thought about all those evenings when I had wondered vaguely where Thomas was, had assumed he was at the corner store taking his time or chatting with neighbors. All that time he had been here, making sure these people had at least one reliable source of nutrition. The knowledge humbled me and shamed me in equal measure. While I had been mindlessly cooking rice for a household of 2, unable to imagine any purpose beyond maintaining our quiet routine, Thomas had been feeding dozens. As autumn arrived and the evenings grew cooler, I began bringing more than just rice. I sorted through our closets and found coats and blankets we hadn't used in years. I baked extra bread and packed it in bags to distribute. I learned which people had dietary restrictions and which children had food allergies. I began to see faces instead of a nameless mass, to understand individual personalities and needs. And something shifted in me during those weeks. The tight, controlled woman who had spent decades measuring out exactly 2 cups of rice for exactly 2 people began to loosen, to expand, to recognize that there was a whole world of need just beyond the boundaries of my carefully maintained routine. I had been so focused on preserving what little we had, on stretching Thomas's paycheck to cover our bills, on maintaining the appearance of respectability in our working-class neighborhood, that I had forgotten there was another way to live. A way that involved giving instead of just protecting, connecting instead of just maintaining, seeing instead of just looking away. The morning I discovered the notebooks changed everything. I thought I understood about my husband's secret life. It was mid-October, and the weather had turned decisively cold. I was in our bedroom, sorting through Thomas's dresser drawers to find his heavier sweaters for the season, when my hand brushed against something wedged beneath the carefully folded clothes. I pulled it out and found myself holding a spiral-bound notebook, the kind students use for school. The cover was worn and creased, and when I opened it, I saw Thomas's careful handwriting filling page after page. At first, I thought it might be some kind of work log from the factory, notes about production schedules or machine maintenance. But as I began to read, I realized these were personal records, detailed entries about the people at the riverbank encampment. Each person had their own section, and Thomas had documented their stories, their needs, their progress. Raymond's arthritis medications and doctor appointments. Sarah's attempts to get Emma enrolled in school despite having no fixed address. Miguel's physical therapy sessions and job applications. Jennifer's struggle with depression, and her small victories in applying for housing assistance. The entries went back years, starting from when Thomas first encountered the encampment. The earliest entries were brief, almost clinical. Met a man named Raymond today. Vietnam veteran. Sleeps under tarp near the water. Has trouble with his knees. But as the notebooks progressed, the entries became more detailed, more personal. Raymond told me about his daughter today. They haven't spoken in 8 years. She thinks he chose drinking over family. He says he chose drinking to forget the things he saw in the war. But now he's sober and doesn't know how to reach her. Helped him write a letter. Don't know if he'll send it. I sat on the edge of our bed, turning page after page, reading about lives I was only beginning to understand. Thomas had filled 3 notebooks, and I found them all hidden beneath his sweaters. Each entry revealed a man I didn't recognize, someone deeply invested in the welfare of these strangers, someone who spent his free time researching housing programs and job training opportunities, someone who used his own money to buy medications and bus passes and application fees for people who had nothing. There was an entry about Patricia from 2 years earlier. Patricia is getting worse. Her back pain is constant now, and she can barely walk some days. Tried to convince her to go to the free clinic, but she says they'll just give her pills she can't afford to refill. Need to find another solution. Maybe that physical therapist program Linda mentioned when she called last month. Should ask her about it next Sunday. Linda. Our daughter knew about Thomas's work at the encampment. Or at least she knew enough that Thomas felt comfortable asking her for information. How many other people knew about this secret life while I remained completely oblivious? I found an entry dated just a week after our son Tommy died in the car accident. Couldn't go to the riverbank today. Dorothy needed me home. But I keep thinking about Marcus and how he reminds me of Tommy at that age. Same restless energy, same quick mind. Tommy would have been 25 this year. Marcus is 22. Maybe that's why I can't stop trying to help him. Every time I see Marcus figure something out, learn something new, I feel like I'm getting back a small piece of what we lost. The notebook trembled in my hands. Tears blurred the careful handwriting, and I had to set it down for a moment to compose myself. Tommy's death had devastated both of us, but Thomas had never talked about it, never expressed his grief beyond the silent tears he shed at the funeral. I had assumed he was processing it internally, dealing with it in his own way. But here in these hidden notebooks was evidence that Thomas had been channeling his grief into helping a young man who reminded him of our lost son. While I had retreated into the safety of routine, cooking the same meals and following the same schedule as though constancy could protect me from further pain, Thomas had gone out into the world and found a way to transform his sorrow into something meaningful. I spent the entire morning reading those notebooks, and with each page, I felt the foundations of my understanding shifting. The man I thought I had married, the quiet factory worker who came home tired and wanted nothing more than a simple dinner and an evening in front of the television, had never really existed. Or perhaps he had existed once, but somewhere along the way, he had evolved into someone else entirely, and I had been too wrapped up in my own small world to notice. That evening, when Thomas came home from the factory, I was waiting for him at the kitchen table with the notebook spread out in front of me. He stopped in the doorway when he saw them, his face going pale, his lunchbox nearly slipping from his hand. "Dorothy," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm not angry," I said, though my voice shook slightly. "I just want to understand. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? About how much you've been doing, about how much it means to you." Thomas set down his lunchbox slowly and pulled out a chair across from me. He looked older suddenly, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders sagging with a weight I was only beginning to comprehend. Because I thought you'd see it as a waste, he said finally. Our whole marriage we've been careful with money, practical about everything. I thought if I told you I was spending our money on strangers, using our resources to help people who might never be able to pay it back, you'd think I was being foolish. His words hung in the air between us, and I couldn't immediately deny them because there was truth in what he said. The Dorothy I had been a few months ago, before I started going to the riverbank, probably would have questioned his judgment. I would have worried about our retirement savings, about what would happen if we had an emergency, about whether these people were taking advantage of his generosity. I had spent so many years operating from a place of scarcity, so convinced that we barely had enough for ourselves, that I had closed my heart to the possibility of abundance. I read about Marcus, I said quietly, about how he reminds you of Tommy. Thomas's eyes filled with tears and he looked away, staring at the wall behind me as though he couldn't bear to meet my gaze. Every time I help Marcus, I feel like I'm doing something for Tommy, he said, his voice rough. I know it doesn't make logical sense. Tommy's gone, and nothing I do can change that. But when I helped Marcus study for his GED, when I saw him finally understand something he'd been struggling with for just a moment, it felt like Tommy was still here. Like I was still his father, still able to help my son succeed. We sat in silence for a long moment, and I realized that while I had been grieving Tommy by preserving his memory in amber, keeping his room exactly as he left it, looking through old photo albums late at night when Thomas was asleep, my husband had been grieving by trying to save another young man from slipping through society's cracks. Both of us had been trying to process the same unbearable loss, but we had done it in complete isolation from each other, unable or unwilling to share our pain. I want to do more, I said finally. Not just bring rice and vegetables. I want to help the way you've been helping. Thomas looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw surprise in his expression. What do you mean? I've been thinking, I said, choosing my words carefully. I know how to cook and I know how to stretch a budget. What if we use some of our savings to set up a real kitchen at the encampment? Something more than just Patricia's camping stove. We could cook proper meals, feed more people, maybe even teach some of them cooking skills they could use to get jobs. Thomas shook his head slowly. Dorothy, our savings are for retirement. We can't just spend them on something like this. Why not? I challenged, feeling a spark of something unfamiliar rising in my chest. What are we saving for exactly? We're both in our 70s, Thomas. We don't travel. We don't buy expensive things. We live in the same small house we've had for 40 years. That money is just sitting in the bank, earning a tiny amount of interest, waiting for some future emergency that may never come. Meanwhile, there are people right now who need help, who could benefit from what we have. It's not responsible, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. According to who? I pressed. According to some rule book about how retired people are supposed to behave. We've been responsible our entire lives, Thomas. We've saved and sacrificed and done everything we were supposed to do. And yes, we have a comfortable life because of it. But what's the point of all that comfort if we're not using what we have to make any kind of difference? I could see the conflict playing out across his face. Thomas had always been cautious with money, shaped by growing up during economic hardship, and then spending decades in a working-class job where financial security was never guaranteed. The idea of deliberately spending a significant portion of our savings went against every instinct he had cultivated over a lifetime. Let me show you something, I said, standing up from the table. I went to my sewing room, a converted closet where I kept my sewing machine and craft supplies, and retrieved the envelope I had hidden in my fabric drawer. Inside was $3,000 in cash, money I had been secretly saving for over a decade by skimming a few dollars here and there from our grocery budget and other household expenses. I had started this secret fund after Tommy died, driven by some vague fear that I needed money of my own, resources that Thomas didn't know about, a safety net in case something terrible happened again and I needed to act quickly. I had never spent any of it, never even told Thomas it existed. It had just accumulated over the years, a physical manifestation of my anxiety and need for control. I placed the envelope on the table in front of Thomas. This is mine, I said. Money I've saved separately. I want to use it to buy equipment for a proper kitchen at the encampment. A good camping stove with multiple burners, some large pots and pans, utensils, maybe a folding table and chairs. Whatever we need to feed people properly. Thomas stared at the envelope, then at me. Where did this money come from? I saved it, I admitted. A little bit at a time over many years. I was keeping it for an emergency, but I realize now that there's an emergency happening right now every day for the people at that riverbank. They're the emergency, and we have the resources to help. My husband picked up the envelope, weighing it in his hands as though trying to calculate not just the money inside but the years of fear and anxiety that had gone into accumulating it. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Are you sure about this, Dorothy? Once we start down this path, really committing to helping these people, it's going to change our lives. It's going to cost more than just money. It's going to take time and energy and emotional investment. Some of the people we help will disappoint us. Some of them will fail despite our best efforts. Some of them might even take advantage of our generosity. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Patricia's crooked back and constant pain, about Emma's bright eyes and quick laughter despite living in a tent, about Marcus's determination to get an education against all odds, about Raymond's loneliness and regret. I thought about all the invisible people I had walked past my entire life, all the suffering I had chosen not to see because seeing it would require me to do something about it. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm sure." The next day, Thomas and I went shopping together. We drove to a camping supply store on the outskirts of town, and I picked out a professional-grade camping stove with 4 burners, the kind wilderness guides use for extended expeditions. We bought 3 large cooking pots, a commercial-size frying pan, serving utensils, plates, bowls, and cups. We went to a hardware store and purchased a sturdy folding table, folding chairs, and plastic storage containers to keep supplies dry and organized. At a restaurant supply store, we bought industrial-sized containers of cooking oil, spices, and other staples. By the time we finished, we had spent nearly $2,000, and Thomas's truck was loaded with equipment. He kept looking at everything we had bought with a mixture of excitement and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite accept that we were really doing this. "Dorothy," he said as we drove back home, "I've been going to that riverbank for 5 years, and in all that time I never thought it would turn into something like this. I was just one man bringing rice and trying to help a few people. But if we really set up a proper kitchen, if we start cooking full meals every day, this is going to become something bigger. We're going to need help. We can't do this alone." "Then we'll find help," I said simply. That evening, instead of going directly to the riverbank, we stopped at the community center in our neighborhood. There was a bulletin board in the entrance hall where people posted notices about garage sales, lost pets, and community events. I had brought paper and markers from home, and I created a simple flyer. Volunteers needed to help feed homeless community at Clearwater Riverbank. Looking for people who can cook, serve meals, or donate supplies. No experience necessary, just a willing heart. Contact Dorothy or Thomas Chen. I included our phone number and posted the flyer prominently in the center of the board. Thomas watched me work, and when I stepped back to look at what I had created, he put his arm around my shoulders. "You've changed," he said quietly. "So have you," I replied. "I'm just finally catching up." Over the next week, we received 7 phone calls from people who had seen the flyer. Most were retired folks like us, people with time on their hands and a desire to contribute to their community. There was Helen, a 75-year-old widow who said she was lonely and wanted something meaningful to do with her days. There was Robert and Susan, a couple in their 60s who had recently sold their small restaurant and missed the daily work of feeding people. There was James, a retired teacher who said he had driven past the riverbank encampment countless times and always felt guilty for not stopping to help. We organized a meeting at our house, cramming 8 people into our small living room. I served tea and cookies while Thomas explained the situation at the riverbank, the number of people living there, their various needs and circumstances. Patricia came too, taking the bus from near the encampment to speak about what would be most helpful from the community's perspective. "What we need most is consistency," Patricia explained. "We get donations sometimes, churches bring food, individuals drop off clothes. But it's random and unpredictable. One week we have too much of something, the next week we have nothing. What would really help is knowing that every evening there will be a hot meal. That's stability. That's something people can count on." The volunteers asked questions, practical ones about logistics and supplies, but also deeper ones about safety, and whether this kind of help was really addressing the root causes of homelessness. Patricia answered patiently, explaining that while hot meals wouldn't solve the complex systemic issues that created homelessness, They did provide the foundation of survival upon which other solutions could be built. It's hard to look for work when you're hungry, she said. It's hard to fill out housing applications when you're weak from malnutrition. It's hard to maintain hope when you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Food is fundamental. Everything else builds from there. By the end of the meeting, we had committed to a schedule. Every evening, 2 or 3 volunteers would come to the riverbank to prepare and serve a hot meal. We would rotate responsibilities so no one would burn out, and we would pool our resources to buy supplies. Robert and Susan offered to use their connections with their former restaurant suppliers to get food at wholesale prices. Helen offered to organize donation drives for non-perishable goods. James said he would research grants and funding opportunities from charitable foundations. I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest as I listened to these people, strangers a week ago, now coming together around a common purpose. It was hope, I realized. Not the passive hope that things might somehow get better on their own, but active hope born from seeing what could be accomplished when people decided to act. The first night of our new expanded operation was chaotic. We had too many volunteers and not enough organization. People bumped into each other around the cooking area, unsure of their responsibilities. The food took longer to prepare than anticipated, and the hungry people waiting grew restless. A fight broke out between 2 of the younger men over something trivial, tensions flaring from hunger and frustration. One of our new volunteers, a woman named Margaret, looked overwhelmed and whispered to me that maybe this was a mistake, maybe we were in over our heads. But Patricia moved through the chaos with calm authority, directing traffic, resolving conflicts, gently instructing the volunteers on the realities of the community they were serving. Thomas worked alongside her, his 5 years of experience evident in how he navigated the social dynamics of the encampment. And gradually, order emerged from the confusion. The food was served, people ate, tensions eased. By the time we finished cleaning up, it was nearly 10 o'clock at night, and I was exhausted in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Thomas and I walked home through the dark streets in silence, both too tired for conversation. When we finally reached our house and I collapsed into bed, every muscle aching, I expected to fall asleep immediately. Instead, I lay awake, my mind replaying the evening. Despite all the problems, despite the chaos and the mistakes, we had fed over 60 people a hot, nutritious meal. 60 people who might otherwise have gone hungry had gone to sleep with full stomachs. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And something I was learning was infinitely better than nothing. The chaos gradually transformed into routine over the following weeks. We learned to coordinate better, to arrive earlier to allow enough preparation time, to anticipate problems before they escalated. Robert took charge of the cooking, his restaurant experience invaluable in scaling recipes for large groups. Helen organized a system for tracking supplies and creating shopping lists. Susan handled serving, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. James spent his time talking with people about their situations, gathering information about needs that extended beyond food. And I found my role somewhere in the middle of everything, filling gaps wherever they appeared. Some days I cooked, some days I served, some days I sat with people and just listened to their stories. I learned that listening was perhaps the most valuable thing I could offer. So many of the people at the riverbank were invisible to society, ignored or actively avoided by the general public. Simply acknowledging their existence, treating them as people worthy of attention and respect, seemed to matter as much as the food we provided. Emma, the 5-year-old girl living in a tent with her mother Sarah, attached herself to me during those weeks. She would appear at my side whenever I arrived at the riverbank, her small hand slipping into mine, chattering about her day in the unfiltered way of young children. She told me about the birds she watched near the river, about the games she invented with rocks and sticks, about the stories her mother told her at night to help her fall asleep despite the cold and the noise and the uncertainty of their situation. One evening, Emma asked me if I had any children. I told her about Linda, who lived far away but called every Sunday, and about Tommy, who had died years ago in an accident. Emma considered this information seriously, her small face solemn. "That's very sad," she said. "But I bet Tommy is happy you're helping people now. I bet he can see you from heaven and he's proud of you." Her innocent words hit me with unexpected force, and I had to turn away for a moment to compose myself. When I looked back, Emma was still watching me with those wide, knowing eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "Will you teach me to cook?" She asked. Mama says cooking is an important skill. She says if I learn to cook good food, I can always find work and take care of myself. Over the next several evenings, Emma became my assistant. I taught her to wash vegetables properly, to measure rice, to stir the large pots without burning herself. She was a quick learner, eager and attentive, asking questions about why we did things certain ways. Her mother Sarah watched from a distance, and I could see the relief in her eyes, the gratitude that her daughter was learning something useful, that someone was investing time and attention in Emma's future, even though their present was so uncertain. Teaching Emma reminded me of teaching Linda to cook years ago in our kitchen. Back when Linda was young and life seemed full of possibility, I had poured so much energy into raising my daughter, trying to equip her with skills she would need to navigate the world. But once Linda grew up and moved away, that sense of purpose had evaporated. I had continued cooking, but only mechanically, without the investment of teaching someone, of passing on knowledge, of contributing to someone else's growth. Now, with Emma's small hands carefully measuring out rice under my supervision, I felt that sense of purpose returning. It didn't matter that Emma wasn't my granddaughter, wasn't related to me by blood. She was a child who needed guidance, and I had knowledge to share. That was enough. November arrived with cold rain that turned the riverbank into a muddy expanse. The tents leaked, people's belongings got soaked, and the mood in the encampment turned grim. Several people developed coughs and colds that lingered, made worse by exposure and inadequate shelter. Our evening meals became even more important, not just for nutrition but for morale, a brief respite from the misery of living outdoors in increasingly harsh conditions. Patricia collapsed during dinner service on a Tuesday evening in late November. One moment she was ladling soup into bowls, and the next she was on the ground, her face contorted in pain, unable to move. The ambulance took 20 minutes to arrive, and during that time I knelt beside her in the mud, holding her hand while she tried not to scream. Her back had finally given out completely, the years of injury and inadequate medical care culminating in a crisis that could no longer be ignored. They kept her in the hospital for 3 days. The doctors said she needed surgery, that without it she would likely lose mobility permanently. But surgery cost money that Patricia didn't have, and her lack of insurance meant the hospital was only obligated to stabilize her, not to provide the extensive treatment she actually needed. They discharged her with pain medication and a referral to a clinic that had a 6-month waiting list for patients without coverage. Thomas and I visited her at the hospital before she was released. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by pain and the institutional setting. Her face was gray, and she moved with the careful slowness of someone whose body had become a source of constant agony, rather than a reliable tool. "I can't go back to the riverbank like this," she said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I can barely walk. How am I supposed to sleep on the ground, to live in a tent? But I have nowhere else to go. No family, no friends with space to take me in. This is it. This is how it ends for people like me." I looked at Thomas, and something passed between us without words. We had been married for 42 years, and in that moment we understood each other completely. "You're coming home with us," I said to Patricia. She stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "What?" "We have a spare bedroom," I continued. "It was our son's room, but he died years ago and it's just been sitting empty. You'll stay with us until you recover, until we can figure out a longer-term solution." Patricia shook her head weakly. "I can't accept that. You barely know me. I'm homeless, Dorothy. I have nothing to offer you in return. You've been feeding people and organizing that community for years," Thomas said quietly. "You've given more than most people ever do. Let us help you now." The drive home with Patricia was silent except for her occasional gasps of pain when the car hit bumps in the road. We had borrowed a wheelchair from the hospital, and Thomas and I struggled to get her up the front steps and into the house. Our home, which had seemed so small and cramped when I was raising children in it, suddenly felt enormous with all its space and comfort. Patricia looked around with the bewildered expression of someone who had forgotten that houses could be warm and dry, that beds could be soft, that walls could provide genuine protection from the elements. I had spent the morning cleaning Tommy's room, changing the sheets, clearing out some of the memorabilia that had accumulated over the years. It had hurt to disturb his space, this shrine I had maintained to his memory. But as I helped Patricia settle into the bed, As I saw the relief wash over her face when she lay down on an actual mattress with clean pillows, I understood that keeping Tommy's room frozen in time had been about my grief, not about honoring his memory. Tommy would have wanted this space to be used, would have wanted someone in need to benefit from it. Over the following days, our house transformed. Patricia's presence changed the atmosphere, filled the silence that Thomas and I had grown accustomed to. She was a gracious guest, almost too gracious, constantly apologizing for being a burden, for needing help with basic tasks, for existing in our space. But gradually, as her pain medication began to work, and she started to relax into the security of having a roof over her head, her natural warmth and humor emerged. She told us stories about her life before homelessness, about her career as a nurse, about the patients she had cared for, and the satisfaction she had found in helping people heal. She told us about her divorce 20 years earlier, about her daughter who had sided with her father and cut off contact, about the loneliness that had defined her life long before she lost her housing. And she listened to our stories too, asking questions about our marriage, about Linda and Tommy, about the life we had built in this small house. One evening, about a week after Patricia moved in, Linda called for her usual Sunday conversation. I told her about Patricia, about the expanded feeding operation at the riverbank, about how Thomas and I had been spending our time. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mom," Linda said finally, "I don't know what to say. This doesn't sound like you at all. You've always been so careful, so risk-averse. And now you're telling me you've brought a homeless woman into your house? That you're spending your savings feeding strangers? Are you feeling okay? Is something wrong?" Her concern was genuine. I could hear it in her voice, but there was also an undertone of judgment, a hint that she thought I had lost my grip on reality. And maybe I had, in a way. The Dorothy that Linda knew, the mother who had raised her with strict routines and careful budgeting, who had never taken chances or done anything impulsive, would never have made these choices. But that Dorothy had been slowly suffocating under the weight of her own caution. "I'm better than I've been in years," I told Linda honestly. "I know it seems strange from the outside, but this work feels right. Feels like something I should have been doing all along." "What about Dad?" Linda asked. "What does he think about all this?" I glanced over at Thomas, who was sitting in his usual chair reading the newspaper while Patricia dozed on the couch nearby, the television playing quietly in the background. "Your father is the one who started all of this," I said. "He's been going to that riverbank for 5 years, helping people while I was completely oblivious. I'm just finally joining him in something he's been doing alone for far too long." Another pause, and then Linda said something that surprised me. "I knew about it, Mom. Dad told me years ago. He made me promise not to tell you because he thought you'd worry or try to stop him. I always felt guilty keeping that secret, but I also understood why he wanted something that was just his." The revelation stung, knowing that both my husband and my daughter had shared this knowledge while deliberately excluding me. But I couldn't be angry about it because they had been right. The old Dorothy would have worried. She would have tried to rein in Thomas's generosity, would have calculated the financial risks and the potential dangers, would have found 1,000 reasons why helping strangers was impractical and unwise. "I wish I had known sooner," I said quietly. "I wish I had been the kind of person who could be trusted with that information." "You're that person now," Linda said, and there was warmth in her voice. "Maybe you needed time to become her." December arrived with bitter cold and the first snowfall of the season. The encampment at the riverbank became even more treacherous as ice formed along the water's edge, and the muddy paths between tents froze into uneven ridges. Several people left, heading to emergency shelters or attempting to travel south to warmer climates. But most stayed, either because they had no other options or because the community they had built meant more to them than physical comfort. Our evening meal service became a lifeline for survival. We expanded the menu to include hot soups and stews that could warm people from the inside. And we brought extra blankets and hand warmers to distribute along with the food. James secured a small grant from a local foundation, enough to buy propane heaters for the communal areas where people gathered. It wasn't enough to make the encampment comfortable, but it was enough to prevent the most vulnerable from freezing. Emma caught pneumonia in mid-December. Her mother Sarah brought her to our dinner service one evening, and I could see immediately that something was seriously wrong. Emma's eyes were glassy with fever, her breathing labored and wheezy, her usual bright energy completely absent. Sarah was beside herself with worry but had no way to get Emma to a doctor, no insurance to pay for treatment, no address to give for a clinic appointment even if she could get one. I made a decision without consulting Thomas, without weighing the risks or considering the implications. We're taking her to the emergency room, I said to Sarah. Right now. Sarah started to protest, to explain that she couldn't afford emergency room bills, but I cut her off. We'll figure out the money later. Your daughter needs medical attention now. Thomas drove while I sat in the back seat with Emma cradled against me, her small body burning with fever. Sarah sat in the front passenger seat, twisting her hands together anxiously. At the hospital, I claimed Emma as my granddaughter to avoid complicated questions about guardianship and insurance. I gave them our address and our insurance information, knowing that we would likely end up paying out of pocket for whatever treatment Emma needed. The doctors admitted Emma overnight for 4 antibiotics and breathing treatments. Sarah refused to leave her side, so I stayed too, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair in Emma's hospital room while Sarah dozed sitting up in another chair, her hand never leaving her daughter's arm. Thomas went home and returned the next morning with changes of clothes and breakfast for all of us. Emma recovered quickly with proper treatment, and within 3 days she was well enough to be discharged. But the experience had shaken Sarah profoundly. She kept thanking me over and over, saying she didn't know how she would ever repay us for what we had done. The medical bills totaled over $4,000, a sum that would have horrified the old Dorothy, who had spent decades pinching pennies and avoiding unnecessary expenses. But watching Emma breathe easily again, seeing the color return to her cheeks and the light come back to her eyes, I couldn't regret a single dollar. This was what money was for, I realized. Not to hoard against imaginary future disasters, but to address real present emergencies. Not to accumulate for its own sake, but to deploy when it could make a meaningful difference in someone's life. Patricia's presence in our home had settled into a comfortable routine. She had begun physical therapy twice a week, funded by a charitable program James had found, and her mobility was slowly improving. She insisted on contributing to the household despite her limitations, folding laundry, helping with meal planning, keeping me company during the long days when Thomas was at work. She had become something more than a guest, something like family, and I realized I had grown to depend on her companionship in ways I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon in January, Patricia and I were sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea when she said something that changed everything. I've been thinking about the encampment, about all the people still living there in the cold. And I've been thinking about this house, about how much space you and Thomas have. What would you think about turning this place into something more? Not just a home for the 3 of us, but a transitional housing program for people trying to get off the streets. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Our home had been our private sanctuary for over 40 years, the place where we retreated from the world. Opening it up permanently to strangers would fundamentally alter the nature of our lives. But I couldn't immediately dismiss the idea because it made a certain kind of sense. We had already taken in Patricia. We had already committed ourselves to helping the homeless community in significant ways. Why not take the next logical step? I need to talk to Thomas, I said. That evening after dinner, the 3 of us sat in the living room and discussed Patricia's proposal. Thomas was initially hesitant, raising all the concerns I expected about privacy, safety, and the practical challenges of managing such a program. But as we talked through the possibilities, I could see him warming to the idea. We could convert the basement, he said thoughtfully. It's finished, but we never use it. We could put in a couple of beds down there, create a separate living space, and maybe build a small addition off the back of the house. Nothing fancy, just enough room for a few more people. Over the next weeks, the plan took shape. We would convert our home into a small transitional housing facility, able to accommodate up to 6 people at a time. Residents would be referred through Patricia's connections with social service agencies, would be expected to contribute to household chores and meal preparation, and would receive support in finding employment and permanent housing. It would be informal and unlicensed, operating under the radar of official regulations, but it would provide a crucial stepping stone for people trying to escape homelessness. We used the remainder of our savings for the renovations. Thomas did most of the work himself with help from some of the men at the encampment who had construction experience. They built the addition, installed beds and dressers in the basement, created a second bathroom to accommodate more people. Our quiet house became a construction zone, filled with noise and dust and the energy of transformation. Linda came to visit in February, ostensibly to check on us but clearly worried about what we were doing. She walked through the house, taking in the changes, the new walls and freshly painted rooms, the beds waiting for occupants. She pulled me aside in the kitchen, away from Thomas and Patricia and the construction workers. "Mom, are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "You're in your 70s. This is going to be exhausting. And what if something goes wrong? What if someone steals from you or becomes violent or causes problems with the neighbors?" All of those things might happen, I admitted. But they also might not. And if we don't try, if we just keep living the way we have been, safe and comfortable and separate from everyone else's suffering, then what's the point of everything we've accumulated? What's the purpose of this house, this security, if we're not using it to help anyone? Linda looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You've changed so much," she said. "Sometimes I feel like I don't recognize you anymore." "I'm still your mother," I assured her. "I'm just finally becoming the person I was supposed to be all along." Our first resident after Patricia was Marcus, the young man who Thomas had been mentoring for years. He moved into one of the basement rooms in March and immediately began contributing to the household. He helped with cooking, took over yard work, ran errands for those of us who were older and less mobile. And he started his classes at the community college, coming home each evening excited to share what he had learned, the same enthusiasm Tommy had shown when he was discovering new things. Sarah and Emma moved in next, taking the second basement room. Sarah found a job at a local grocery store, working evening shifts while I watched Emma, helping her with homework and teaching her to cook more advanced dishes. Emma flourished in the stability of consistent shelter, regular meals, and the attention of adults who cared about her future. She started attending school regularly for the first time in years, and her teachers reported that she was bright and eager to learn, just needed the foundation of security to let her natural abilities shine. Raymond came next, the elderly veteran with arthritis who had been living at the encampment since before Thomas started his work there. He moved into the converted addition, and Thomas spent hours with him, helping him navigate the VA system to access benefits he had earned but never received. Slowly, Raymond's health improved with regular medication, better nutrition, and the simple dignity of having his own space. Our house was full and loud and chaotic in ways it had never been before. There were always people around, always conversations happening, always someone needing something. The carefully maintained boundaries between public and private space dissolved. Our kitchen became a communal area where multiple people cooked at different times. Our living room was always occupied with someone watching television or reading or just sitting quietly. The bathroom schedule required a post-it chart to avoid conflicts. It was exhausting. It was overwhelming. It was the most alive I had felt in decades. Thomas and I fell into bed exhausted each night, but it was a good exhaustion, the tiredness that comes from meaningful work rather than from grinding through empty routines. We talked more than we had in years, planning meals and coordinating schedules, solving problems together, functioning as a team in ways we hadn't since our children were young. The riverbank encampment slowly emptied as people either moved into our house or found other housing solutions with the intensive support we were providing. By April, only about 15 people remained at the riverbank, down from over 60 at the program's peak. James had successfully secured additional grants that allowed us to help people with security deposits and first month's rent for apartments. Patricia had connected with a network of landlords willing to rent to people with poor credit or spotty rental histories. The transformation wasn't universal. Some people we tried to help disappeared back into the patterns that had led to homelessness in the first place. Some struggled with addictions we weren't equipped to address. Some simply weren't ready to accept the structure and expectations that came with transitional housing. Each failure hurt, reminded me that good intentions and generous resources couldn't solve every problem. But the successes outweighed the failures. Marcus graduated from community college with a certificate in computer programming and got a job at a tech startup. He moved into his own apartment, holding the keys with trembling hands, hardly able to believe that he had his own place, his own space that no one could take away from him. Sarah saved enough money to move into a small rental house with Emma. And on moving day, Emma hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering thank you over and over into my shoulder. One Sunday in June, the phone rang with Linda's usual weekly call. But this time, instead of her standard questions about our health and what we had been doing, she had news. "I've been thinking about what you and Dad are doing," she said, "and I want to help. My company has a charitable foundation, and I proposed your housing program as a recipient. They approved a grant of $25,000. I sat down heavily, the phone pressed to my ear, unable to speak for a moment. $25,000 was more than Thomas and I had spent in total on the entire project. It was enough to help dozens more people, to expand the program, to make a real systematic difference rather than just addressing individual cases. "Linda," I finally managed to say. "Thank you. I should have helped sooner," she said, and I could hear the regret in her voice. "I should have believed in what you were doing instead of questioning it. But I'm here now and I want to be part of this." On a warm evening in July, we held a celebration at our house to mark 1 year since Thomas and I had begun working together at the riverbank. We invited everyone who had been part of the journey, all the volunteers who had helped prepare and serve meals, all the former residents who had moved into stable housing, all the current residents still living with us. Our small yard was filled with people, the grill smoking with hamburgers and vegetables, tables laden with side dishes that everyone had contributed. Children ran between the adults, playing games in the fading light. Patricia moved through the crowd with surprising ease, her back much improved after months of physical therapy and proper care. Marcus stood near the grill talking to Raymond, the young and old finding common ground in their shared experience of rebuilding their lives. Thomas found me standing at the edge of the yard, watching the celebration. He put his arm around my waist, pulling me close. "Do you remember that night when you followed me to the riverbank?" he asked. "When you discovered what I had been doing?" I nodded. I was so confused. I couldn't understand why you had kept it secret from me for so long. "I kept it secret because I thought you were someone else," he said. "I thought you were the person you had been, the cautious woman who measured out exactly 2 cups of rice for exactly 2 people. But you weren't that person anymore. Maybe you never really were. Maybe you were just waiting for a reason to become who you actually are." I looked around at the people filling our yard. This unlikely community we had helped build from nothing more than rice and intention. A year ago, I had been invisible, going through the motions of a life that held no real meaning. I had cooked rice every day without thinking about where it went or who it fed. I had lived in a house that echoed with the ghosts of memories while ignoring the real, living people suffering just beyond my narrow view. Now I was 71 years old and I was finally truly alive. My house was full of noise and chaos and need. My savings account was nearly empty. My carefully maintained routines had been destroyed, and I had never been happier. Emma appeared at my side, tugging on my sleeve. "Dorothy, can I help you make the rice tomorrow? I want to learn that recipe you used, the one with the garlic and herbs." "Of course," I said, taking her small hand in mine. "We'll make it together." As the sun set and the celebration continued around us, I understood that this was my legacy. Not the house or the possessions or the money carefully saved over decades. Those things had simply been waiting, accumulating value until the moment I discovered what they were actually for. My legacy was the meals shared, the lives touched, the small daily acts of kindness that added up to transformation. It was the rice that fed hungry people, the rooms that sheltered the vulnerable, the time and attention given freely to those the world had forgotten. Thomas had started this work alone, carrying the weight of his compassion in secret for 5 years. But I had finally joined him, and together we had built something that would outlast us both. Something that would continue to grow and evolve long after we were gone, spreading outward in ripples we would never fully see or understand. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.